I just finished recording yesterday's devotional. I do this in kind of a week by week batch when I record, and it just hit me. I can't remember now if I gave the blessing at the end of Monday's devotional. I'm not going to go back and look, but if I didn't, I hope you filled it in for yourself. Or wait a second. Um, Again, it's not that they're magic words. They're not, and that's not why I give them or say them, and have begun doing that over this past year. It's not that I see that they have any magic, in themselves. They're not a formula. Um, it's words like how Jesus taught his disciples to pray. Um, the Lord's Prayer is not to be about a formula, but it's to evoke and remind us of certain truths. And so I hope that that's what this blessing that I've been doing is for you, and how you're hearing them. It's the spirit in which I'm giving them. Anyways, 1 Kings 15 and 16. Jeroboam, his line ends. Fighting between Israel and Judah just continues and intensifies in different ways. And now the structure of the book of Kings is going to kind of flip between the kings of that northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom of Judah. And it does so chronologically. So like if you looked at kind of a timeline, you saw, oh, like this king of Israel ruled for 40 years. And in year 6, this king of Israel started. And then in year 12, that king of Israel started. And then, that king ruled until after the king of Judah died. It kind of just flips back and forth based on just a year-to-year chronological progression. Some kings are hardly going to get any mention at all. Others get more ink as the editor to this book, or editors, are crafting this to speak to certain themes and truths and reminders to the people of God in their generation. Because again, Kings was not written to us today, but it was written still for us, inspired by the Holy Spirit. We're going to see at times as well some prophets and their interactions with kings on behalf of God. The most famous prophets in the book of Kings are Elijah, who we'll begin to look at tomorrow, and then his successor, Elisha, who we'll just see introduced at the end of Friday's devotional, or rather the section of Kings that we're going to be reading. The establishment of the temple in Jerusalem under Solomon was to kind of be a sort of resetting of covenant, kind of let's restart this project again that was started in Genesis in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, and we're going to kind of reset. And that's why the temple had all this garden imagery, the connection point between heaven and earth, God's residence, dwelling place with humanity. And so that temple was kind of be that place where order would then spread through God's people into the world around. And we see it didn't last that long because of covenant unfaithfulness to God. Some of the kings we're going to read experienced political success. Their borders expanded. They had influence over other nations. But the valuation of kingly success in Kings and in kind of the companion historical work in the Old Testament, the books of Chronicles, the valuation of whether a king was successful or not had to do with their heart, their faithfulness, their obedience to God. Not about whether or not the kingdom expanded or saw prosperity. For example, we see the king Asa, and it begins with, he did right in the eyes of the Lord. And there's a lot of good things he did. He got rid of a lot of the pagan worship and idolatry in the nation. He didn't get rid of all of it, but he worked towards that. His heart, the text says, he was fully committed to God. And so I think there's a part we see kind of the limitations of leadership. Had great influence, did a lot of good things, but you can't legislate, you can't change everyone's heart. But Asa, on the whole, was a good king in the eyes of the editors of Kings and Chronicles, as we'll get there and read that. But Asa was not a perfect king. He plundered the temple to pay a bribe to a foreign king to protect Judah from Israel, the northern kingdom. Again, that's just a failure to trust God. we'll also see in this chapter, or in this section, we see God's promise concerning the family of Jeroboam fulfilled, as Jeroboam's son was the last of his line. And so, again, a lot of civil unrest, a lot of political upheaval in the northern kingdom of Israel, and it's not going to stop. At the end, we see Israel, kind of the line of kings, leads to one of the most infamous kings and queen of the northern kingdom of Israel, Ahab and his wife Jezebel. Just a little side note, and it's actually the part I want to kind of tie into just a point of reflection today. At the end of chapter 16, we read of Jericho being rebuilt, and the one who's doing so, 2 of his sons died. Again, that may just kind of go, well, that's an interesting historical note. Why is that there? It's actually fulfillment of the words of Joshua in Joshua chapter 6, verse 26, where Joshua, when the walls of Jericho fell and the city was conquered, Joshua made a pronouncement that, hey, if this city gets rebuilt, it's going to be at the cost of 2 boys, kind of at the beginning and kind of close of that. And so there's, again, it's one of these hyperlinks that when we're reading scriptures, like, oh, has this been mentioned before? Where's this theme? It takes a little bit of work, but it also comes from just as we read and reread and reread and talk and listen to others and learn, we see, well, here, this is part of how God works. How God works is that God will say certain things and then he will allow us to reap the consequences of either our obedience or our disobedience. Now, that doesn't mean that there's this, again, this magical line between every time I obey, that means everything is going to go right. And every individual time I disobey, everything is going to go wrong. But it's the arc, it's the pattern, it's how God works. Again, we looked earlier, God promises that there's consequence for disobedience, but God also often mitigates those consequences, often, not always, mitigates those consequences based on his faithfulness and love and looking to work through his people. So again, I just want to encourage you in this, that God does deal with this, and God's judgment is often found in the consequences for our obedience, our loyalty or disloyalty. And so maybe it's just take a few moments after this devotional, just pause and just offer your heart, your life, your all to God again today. As just whatever point you're listening to this, for the rest of this day, God, I'm going to seek to be loyal to you, be that living sacrifice, as Paul would put it in Romans 12. And as you look to do that, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you. May the Lord be gracious to you. And today would you know his peace. God bless.